He smiled as he poured the wine, his hand steady, almost too steady, and said to my millionaire son, "Those words hit me differently than usual. Normally, a toast like that would feel warm, celebratory, maybe even a little proud. But tonight, there was something in his eyes I couldn't place. A glint that didn't belong, a shadow beneath the curve of his lips. I thanked him, raised my glass with a smile that I knew was polite, careful not to give away the suspicion building in my chest. And then I did it. Quietly, almost imperceptibly, I swapped my glass with his while he was distracted by a story my sister was telling across the table. 30 minutes. That's all the time it took for everything to shift in ways no one, least of all him, could have predicted. My name is Ethan, and I'm 32. I come from a family that the outside world would call successful, wealthy even. But behind closed doors, we've always been a tangle of ambition, ego, and secrets too long buried to forget. Growing up under my father's sharp eye meant learning how to watch, to listen, and above all, to never let my guard down even at a family dinner. And yet, despite all that, nothing could have prepared me for the moment he handed me that glass of wine. Something about the way he said, "To my millionaire son," felt like a challenge, a test, or worse, a trap. The dining room was alive with the usual chatter, my mother asking about college friends, my younger sister laughing at an inside joke, my brother nodding along, pretending not to care. But beneath all the casual conversations, I felt the tension stretching taut like a wire. My father sat at the head of the table, polished, confident, the kind of presence that made people either respect him or fear him. I had always respected him, at least outwardly, but tonight fear, subtle, prickling fear, lipped under my skin. I remember watching him as he refilled his glass, his eyes darting just slightly to mine, as if testing whether I noticed the slightest irregularity in his smile. Something was off. I don't know if it was instinct or the memory of too many family secrets, or the knowledge of how careful he could be with power. But I felt the weight of suspicion settle on my shoulders. I needed to act, and I needed to act fast. Swapping the glasses was simple in execution, but monumental in consequence. Every careful movement, every silent heartbeat as I slid my wine into his glass and his into mine, felt like stepping onto a stage where one misstep could cost more than embarrassment. It could cost everything. As I set my eyes back on the table, I tried to act normal, to laugh along with a joke my mother told about a failed vacation, to nod at my sister's stories. But inside, time was moving differently. Every tick of the clock was magnified. 30 minutes, that was all the wait. 30 minutes of pretending, of holding my breath, of imagining the fallout of what would happen when the first sip revealed more than just wine in a glass. I could feel it, the quiet anticipation building in my chest, the knowledge that tonight, something hidden for years was about to surface. The table felt smaller somehow, the faces closer, yet blurred by the tension between us. I watched my father lift his glass, never once noticing that the liquid he thought he had prepared for me had already changed hands. I wondered briefly if he had always been this cunning, this meticulous in his planning, and then I realized, yes, he had. Every action, every smile, every carefully chosen word over the years had trained me to expect the unexpected. But for the first time, the game was mine to control. He smiled as he poured the wine, his hand steady, almost too steady, and said, "To my millionaire son." Those words hit me differently than usual. Normally, a toast like that would feel warm, celebratory, maybe even a little proud. But tonight, there was something in his eyes I couldn't place. A glint that didn't belong, a shadow beneath the curve of his lips. I thanked him, raised my glass with a smile that I knew was polite, careful not to give away the suspicion building in my chest. And then I did it. Quietly, almost imperceptibly, I swapped my glass with his while he was distracted by a story my sister was telling across the table. 30 minutes, that's all the time it took for everything to shift in ways no one, least of all him, could have predicted. My name is Ethan, and I'm 32. I come from a family that the outside world would call successful, wealthy even. But behind closed doors, we've always been a tangle of ambition, ego, and secrets too long buried to forget. Growing up under my father's sharp eye meant learning how to watch, to listen, and above all, to never let my guard down even at a family dinner. And yet, despite all that, nothing could have prepared me for the moment he handed me that glass of wine. Something about the way he said, "To my millionaire son," felt like a challenge, a test, or worse, a trap. The dining room was alive with the usual chatter, my mother asking about college friends, my younger sister laughing at an inside joke, my brother nodding along, pretending not to care. But beneath all the casual conversations, I felt the tension stretching taut like a wire. My father sat at the head of the table, polished, confident, the kind of presence that made people either respect him or fear him. I had always respected him, at least outwardly, but tonight fear, subtle, prickling fear, lipped under my skin. I remember watching him as he refilled his glass, his eyes darting just slightly to mine, as if testing whether I noticed the slightest irregularity in his smile. Something was off. I don't know if it was instinct, or the memory of too many family secrets, or the knowledge of how careful he could be with power. But I felt the weight of suspicion settle on my shoulders. I needed to act, and I needed to act fast. Swapping the glasses was simple in execution, but monumental in consequence. Every careful movement, every silent heartbeat as I slid my wine into his glass and his into mine, felt like stepping onto a stage where one misstep could cost more than embarrassment. It could cost everything. As I set my eyes back on the table, I tried to act normal, to laugh along with a joke my mother told about a failed vacation, to nod at my sister's stories. But inside, time was moving differently. Every tick of the clock was magnified. 30 minutes, that was all the wait. 30 minutes of pretending, of holding my breath, of imagining the fallout of what would happen when the first sip revealed more than just wine in a glass. I could feel it, the quiet anticipation building in my chest, the knowledge that tonight something hidden for years was about to surface. The table felt smaller somehow, the faces closer, yet blurred by the tension between us. I watched my father lift his glass, never once noticing that the liquid he thought he had prepared for me had already changed hands. I wondered briefly if he had always been this cunning, this meticulous in his planning, and then I realized, yes, he had. Every action, every smile, every carefully chosen word over the years had trained me to expect the unexpected. But for the first time, the game was mine to control. As the minutes passed, the conversation around the table seemed to blur into background noise. I found myself studying my father more than listening, noting the small details, the way his fingers gripped the stem of the wine glass, the subtle twitch at the corner of his eye, the faint smile that didn't reach the rest of his face. Something about him was waiting, expecting, but for what, I wasn't sure. My heart pounded, not from fear alone, but from the realization that I held the upper hand, at least for now. I thought back to my childhood, to those quiet moments when he would test me in ways no one else noticed. A misplaced word, a small challenge, a look that seemed casual but cut deeper than any criticism. Those moments taught me to be cautious, to anticipate moves before they were even made. And tonight, it was like all those lessons had led to this single moment. The swap, the silent act of defiance, the balance of power subtly shifting across a polished oak dining table. My sister's laughter echoed across the room, a high, carefree sound that contrasted sharply with the storm brewing in my mind. She had no idea what was happening, none of the undercurrents that ran like hidden rivers beneath our family's surface. I almost envied her simplicity, her oblivion, but envy was short-lived. I had work to do. Focused, I kept my composure, raising my glass with a practiced smile as my father launched into a story about one of his business deals. A story filled with numbers, contracts, and triumphs. Everyone nodded politely, but I noticed the subtle signs of tension even in my mother's eyes, the faint worry lines that appeared when she thought no one was watching. Time crawled. Each tick of the grandfather clock in the corner became a drumbeat, counting down to the inevitable. I felt a strange mix of excitement and apprehension, like standing on the edge of a cliff, knowing the fall was coming, but unsure what awaited below. 30 minutes, that was all it would take. 30 minutes for a secret to reveal itself, for a truth long buried to rise to the surface. And as I sipped my wine, careful to mask my nerves, I imagined the moment of revelation, the shock on his face, the confusion, the unspoken acknowledgement that the tables had turned. I remembered the earlier signs, too subtle to be accidental. The way he had poured my wine with that faintly patronizing smile, the way he had emphasized my millionaire son. As though it carried weight beyond the words themselves, every gesture was calculated, every inflection deliberate. And yet, for all his cunning, he hadn't noticed my move, the one small act that could change the outcome entirely. I felt a surge of satisfaction, not from malice, but from justice, from finally claiming a small piece of agency in a lifetime of careful manipulation. The room continued its gentle hum of conversation, clinking cutlery, laughter, and polite nods. I could hear my father laughing at one of his own jokes, a deep, practiced sound that had always commanded attention. But tonight that laughter felt hollow, as if the joke belonged to someone else entirely. My eyes flicked to his glass, watching as he lifted it to his lips. I forced myself to look away at the last moment, pretending to examine my own drink, pretending to be oblivious to the tension between us. And then it happened, a subtle shift in his expression, a microsecond of hesitation as he swallowed. My pulse quickened. I caught the faintest flicker of confusion, almost imperceptible, but enough to send a thrill through me. The room felt smaller, more charged, as if the walls themselves were leaning in to witness what was coming. My family, oblivious to the invisible war at the head of the table, continued their chatter, their laughter a distant echo in the storm of anticipation building inside me. The seconds stretched into minutes, and the air around the table seemed to thicken. I could feel it, the subtle weight of anticipation that made every movement, every word, feel amplified. My father, still smiling, oblivious to the switch, leaned back slightly in his chair, and I noticed the faint crease between his eyebrows. A twitch, a sign of unease. Did he suspect, or was it something else entirely? I couldn't tell, and that uncertainty made the moment all the more electric. I tried to appear relaxed, lifting my glass in casual sips, nodding along with the conversation, laughing at jokes I didn't find particularly funny. But beneath the surface, my mind was racing. I recalled years of subtle betrayals, small manipulations, and moments where he tested my patience and resolve. It wasn't just about wealth or power. It was about control, about the way he had always tried to dictate the narrative of my life. And tonight, finally, I had the upper hand. My mother's voice broke through my thoughts, soft but insistent, asking if anyone wanted a second serving of the salmon. I heard my father respond in his deep, authoritative tone, smoothly dismissing the offer. Even in this mundane exchange, there was tension, a hidden current. Every gesture, every word, seemed loaded with meaning. I realized then that the real game wasn't in the wine glass, but in the dynamics at the table, in the silent battles fought with glances, inflections, and pauses. I glanced at my siblings, their laughter and chatter providing a bizarre counterpoint to the storm of thoughts in my head. They had no idea, of course, no inkling of the danger or opportunity that hung over the head of the table. My younger brother, always a little naive, passed me the bread basket with a cheerful smile. I returned it politely, hiding the flicker of triumph in my chest. The world outside the table might have seen a simple family dinner, but inside it was a battlefield, and I held a secret weapon. Time ticked by with torturous slowness. I sipped the wine, carefully maintaining my calm. Every small movement of my father's hand, every glance, every half-smile was like a piece of a puzzle falling into place. And then it hit me, the clarity of the moment. For years I had been reactive, waiting for his next move, feeling trapped in the shadows of his decisions. But tonight I was proactive. Tonight I was the one shaping the outcome, quietly but unmistakably. The conversation shifted to a discussion about investments, a topic my father loved, his voice growing animated as he recounted recent successes. His eyes met mine for a brief moment, and I could almost see the calculation behind the smile. For a fleeting second, I wondered if he had anticipated my actions. But then the moment passed, his attention swept away by my sister's excited interjection about a vacation plan. Relief washed over me, followed by a surge of satisfaction. The swap had gone unnoticed. The tension, however, remained. 30 minutes, or what felt like an eternity, passed. The wine in his glass sat untouched for a moment before he raised it again, casually, confidently, unaware that the liquid now contained a reflection of his own intentions. My heart pounded, my breath steady but eager, as I watched him lift the glass, tilt it to his lips, and swallow. And in that single, ordinary motion, the quiet power of my decision began to unfold. The change wasn't immediate, not in a dramatic collapse or sudden outburst. It was subtle, almost imperceptible at first, a twitch of his jaw, a pause mid-conversation, the way his eyes flicked nervously around the table. Everyone continued as if nothing had happened, yet I could sense the shift, the invisible thread of control now firmly in my hands. I had not just swapped glasses, I had swapped roles, quietly but completely reversing the dynamic that had dominated my life for so long. I watched him carefully, my senses sharpened, every expression magnified in my mind. He laughed at something my mother said, but it was a different kind of laugh, shorter, sharper, a little forced, lacking the warmth it usually carried. My pulse quickened. That tiny change, almost invisible to anyone else, was proof that the swap had done what I hoped. He was unsettled, and I felt a thrill, not of cruelty, but of justice finally balancing in my favor. I thought back to the countless family dinners of my childhood, each one a subtle battlefield. My father, with his sharp wit and commanding presence, always had a way of asserting dominance, whether through a casual remark, a pointed joke, or the careful manipulation of information. I had learned to read between the lines, to anticipate the hidden meanings behind his words, but even with years of experience, nothing prepared me for the intensity of this moment. This wasn't just strategy. It was instinct, sharpened by years of observation and silent resistance. As the minutes crawled by, I noticed the tiniest signs of discomfort. His hand, which usually rested confidently on the table, fidgeted slightly. His eyes darted across the room, scanning faces as if seeking an unseen threat. My siblings were oblivious, laughing and chatting, unaware of the invisible tension radiating from the head of the table. My mother, though still composed, had that faint crease of concern on her forehead, a subtle indication that she felt the shift in energy before anyone spoke a word. I reminded myself to stay calm. Every breath I took, every sip I made had to appear casual. I couldn't afford to reveal my anticipation, my satisfaction, or the knowledge that I held the upper hand. I had learned long ago that revealing too much even triumph could give him the advantage again. So I smiled, laughed lightly at my brother's story about a failed business venture, and nodded at my sister's excited chatter. On the surface, everything was normal. Underneath, the power dynamic had already shifted. 30 minutes had passed, and the room seemed to hold its collective breath, though no one realized it. I felt the tension coiled in my chest, ready to spring at any subtle sign, and then I saw it, the moment that made my heart skip a beat. His hand twitched as he reached for the water glass, almost as if he needed to steady himself. His eyes flicked to me, a fleeting glance that held the briefest hint of recognition, a silent acknowledgement that something had changed. But I didn't react. I let it linger, letting the uncertainty build, savoring the quiet victory. My mind drifted to the past, to the subtle lessons my father had unknowingly taught me. He had always believed that control came from power, from wealth, from fear. But I had learned that control could be taken silently, invisibly, with patience and precision. And tonight that lesson was in full effect. Every movement, every glance, every heartbeat was a reminder that I was no longer a passive participant in his carefully orchestrated games. Then came the first ripple of chaos. He coughed slightly, a sharp, unexpected sound, and I noticed the way his hand trembled just enough to betray him. My mother glanced up in concern, my siblings tilted their heads in confusion, but no one connected the dots. The room's energy shifted subtly, an undercurrent of tension threading through the laughter and casual conversation. I felt a rush of vindication, a quiet, private triumph that only I could fully understand. The moments stretched, elongated by the anticipation that hung heavy in the air. I watched as he tried to maintain composure, to act as if nothing was different, and I realized how fragile the facade of control really was. All those years of dominance, of manipulation, could unravel with a single, well-timed action. I had learned patience, timing, and observation, and now, finally, all of it mattered. I could see it now, the subtle cracks forming in my father's composure. The smile that had once been so confident now flickered uncertainly, replaced by a fleeting tension in his jaw, a slight narrowing of his eyes. He tried to cover it with a laugh, a deep, practiced chuckle, but it came out hollow, like a note played too long and out of tune. I felt a shiver of satisfaction not from cruelty, but from recognition. Finally, after years of careful observation, the roles had reversed, and the hunter had become the prey. My mind raced with possibilities. What would he do next? Would he pretend nothing had happened, act oblivious, or attempt some sudden maneuver to regain control? I had to stay sharp, to remain outwardly calm while inside. The storm of anticipation built higher and higher. The room, full of family laughter and clinking cutlery, felt surreal, like a stage set for a private duel, invisible to all but the two players who truly understood the stakes. I thought back to all the subtle lessons he had taught me, often unintentionally: how to read people, how to detect hesitation, how to measure the impact of a word or a glance. Those lessons were my secret weapons tonight. Every twitch of his hand, every slight pause in speech was a signal, a confirmation that the swap had worked exactly as I intended. And yet I had to remain patient. 30 minutes had passed, but the final moments, the true payoff, were yet to arrive. The conversation around the table began to shift, turning toward family business matters. My father leaned forward, his fingers drumming lightly on the polished wood of the table, as he outlined a deal that had recently succeeded. His tone was confident, his words measured, but beneath it, I sensed hesitation. He glanced at me, just briefly, but it was enough. A flicker of recognition, a hint that he might have felt the undercurrent shift, and for the first time in years, I saw doubt in his eyes. I felt the adrenaline course through me, steady and controlled. This wasn't about revenge for the sake of anger. It was about justice, about reclaiming the balance that had always been tilted against me. I sipped my wine, keeping my expression neutral, listening to my father's carefully chosen words while noting the imperceptible ways his body betrayed him. Every twitch, every micro-expression was like a whisper, telling me that I had won a small but decisive victory. And then it happened. A sudden cough, sharp and unexpected, broke the flow of conversation. My father's hand twitched as he reached for his water, the subtle panic barely visible but unmistakable to me. He tried to maintain his composure, but I saw it. A flicker of panic in his eyes, a quick swallow, a tension that hadn't been there before. My siblings glanced at him in confusion. "Are you okay?" my mother asked, her voice calm but laced with concern. He nodded, forcing a smile, but the shadow in his eyes gave him away. A quiet satisfaction settled over me, tempered with a recognition of the seriousness of the moment. This was not a game. The dynamics that had defined our family for decades were being rewritten, quietly, imperceptibly, but irrevocably. I had anticipated every move, accounted for every variable, and now the consequences were unfolding exactly as I had imagined. The next few minutes were a delicate dance. My father tried to engage in the conversation, laughed at jokes, offered comments, but each attempt seemed slightly forced, slightly off. I watched him carefully, savoring the subtle unraveling, while maintaining my own composure. My heart beat steadily, but inside, I felt a rush of vindication. Finally, after years of living under his calculated influence, I had found the moment to assert control without confrontation, without chaos, but with precise timing and careful observation. As the clock ticked toward the end of the 30-minute mark, I could sense the shift becoming complete. The balance had changed, the unspoken rules rewritten. Every glance he offered me carried a hint of recognition, a silent acknowledgement that the game had changed. And I, finally, felt the quiet triumph of strategy, patience, and insight, the culmination of years of careful attention to the subtle currents that flowed beneath the polished surface of our family life. Then it happened, a subtle shift, almost imperceptible at first, but unmistakable once I noticed it. My father's hand trembled slightly as he lifted his glass again, and a fleeting pallor crossed his face. He paused mid-sentence, mid-laugh even, and for the first time that night the room seemed to slow down around him. I caught the faintest hitch in his breath, the tiniest flicker of panic in his eyes. My heart raced, not with fear, but with the electric thrill of anticipation. This was the moment I had orchestrated, the one I had waited for, the one where years of careful observation, patience, and instinct converged into a single point of revelation. He looked at me, really looked, in a way that carried understanding, but also shock. The recognition wasn't loud, it wasn't shouted, but it was there, woven into the tilt of his head, the narrowing of his eyes, the almost imperceptible tension of his jaw. And then it hit me, he knew, or at least he felt it. Something had shifted, and he could sense the invisible thread of control had slipped from his hands. The room felt heavy, charged. My siblings continued their conversation, oblivious, but my mother's eyes flicked between us. There was that brief moment of realization in her gaze, the subtle understanding that something had changed, that this dinner, which had started so ordinarily, had become a battlefield with invisible stakes, and I, quietly but undeniably, held the advantage. He coughed again, sharper this time, and set the glass down with a little too much force. The sound echoed in the room, drawing the attention of everyone at the table. My mother's eyebrows knitted together. "Are you all right?" she asked, calm but firm. He nodded, forcing a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. I could see the tension in his shoulders, the rigidity in his posture, the way he was trying to reassert control while silently acknowledging that the tide had turned. I sipped my wine slowly, deliberately, savoring the moment. There was no rush, no need to gloat. The act itself, the quiet precision of the swap, had already spoken. The victory wasn't in loud confrontation. It was in the subtle, irrevocable shift in power, in the knowledge that I had played the game carefully and won. Years of manipulation, years of calculated dominance, had met their match at this simple act of awareness and timing. My father's lips pressed into a thin line. He tried to engage again, attempting to carry on a conversation about investments, but the ease was gone. The confidence that had always defined him, that had commanded attention and respect, faltered under the invisible weight of what had just happened. I could see it in every micro expression, every subtle hesitation, every brief glance that betrayed the struggle to maintain composure. The rest of the dinner continued, but nothing was the same. Every comment, every laugh, every glance carried a new meaning. The dynamic had shifted, quietly but irrevocably. I could feel it in my posture, in the steadiness of my hands, in the clarity of my thoughts. The balance of power, once unassailable in his favor, had shifted to me, silently, invisibly, completely. And in that quiet triumph, I allowed myself a brief reflection. This wasn't about cruelty or revenge in the simplistic sense. It was about recognition, about standing on equal footing, about finally claiming agency in a life where so much had been controlled by another. The thrill wasn't in destruction. It was in subtle justice, in strategy, in reclaiming control with precision and patience. By the end of the evening, the atmosphere at the table had changed entirely. Laughter continued, conversation flowed, but beneath it all, an unspoken acknowledgment passed between my father and me. A silent, undeniable recognition of the new balance. And for the first time in a long time, I felt fully seen not as the sun in his shadow, but as an equal, capable of observation, strategy, and decisive action. The rest of the evening unfolded like a careful dance, each movement and word layered with tension, even as the surface seemed calm. My father tried to maintain his usual air of authority, but it was thinner now, fraying at the edges. Every glance he cast toward me carried that quiet acknowledgment, an unspoken admission that he had been outmaneuvered, not by chance, but by deliberate observation, timing, and patience. I could see it in the subtle lines around his eyes, the way his fingers drummed lightly on the table, as if testing the strength of the invisible hold I now had over the evening. My siblings continued their chatter, their laughter, and jokes filling the space with normalcy. Yet even in their oblivion, I noticed the microshifts, my mother's occasional flicker of concern, the brief hesitation in my brother's voice when he tried to tell a story, my sister's sideways glances. The energy around the table had transformed subtly, imperceptibly to anyone not attuned, but undeniably present. Control had shifted silently, irrevocably, and the knowledge that I had orchestrated it filled me with a calm satisfaction that was different from any pride I had known before. I reflected on the long path that had led me here, years of carefully observing my father, learning to anticipate his moves, absorbing lessons in subtlety, patience, and restraint. All those small, sometimes painful moments of navigating his sharp wit and influence had culminated in this one evening. And yet, for all the tension, there was no malice in my actions, only justice, quiet and precise. I had reclaimed a balance that had always eluded me, proving to myself, and perhaps to him, that subtle strategy could triumph over brute authority. As dinner wound down, I felt the final pieces of tension dissolve into a more complex energy. The casual clatter of cutlery, the muted hum of conversation, and the gentle smiles of family members, these all carried a new weight now. My father's presence was still commanding, but now tempered by an awareness of limits, a recognition that authority could be challenged in ways that were invisible yet undeniable. I glanced at him one last time before leaving the table, and in that brief moment of eye contact, I saw everything. Recognition, surprise, perhaps even a grudging respect. I understood at that instant that the evening had marked a turning point, not a loud confrontation, not a declared battle, but a quiet shift in understanding, one that would ripple through future dinners, conversations, and decisions. For the first time, I was no longer merely reacting to his actions. I was shaping the environment around me with clarity and precision. Walking away from the table, I felt a calm, profound sense of satisfaction. Not from revenge in the shallow sense, but from the reclamation of agency, from the quiet assertion of intellect and observation over years of dominance and subtle manipulation. It was a triumph born not of spectacle, but of strategy, patience, and awareness, the kind of victory that leaves no bruises, yet reshapes the rules entirely. And as I reflected on that night in the days and weeks that followed, I realized how transformative it had been. Our family interactions, previously governed by unspoken hierarchies and subtle tests, began to shift. My father approached me differently, not with anger, but with a new respect, the acknowledgement that I had learned the game and could play it with skill. And I, in turn, understood the subtle balance of power, the importance of timing, and the value of quiet, calculated action. It wasn't just a story about a glass of wine or a dinner table maneuver. It was a lesson in observation, in patience, in understanding the invisible currents of relationships and influence. It was about seeing clearly, acting decisively, and reclaiming control in ways that are precise, elegant, and ultimately transformative. That night, a single action, a quiet swap, unnoticed by all but myself, became a defining moment, one that reshaped not only the dynamics at the table, but my understanding of strength, strategy, and self-determination, and in that realization I felt a rare, profound peace. The tension, the suspense, the careful calculations, all of it had led to a moment where I could sit back, observe, and know that I had acted with integrity, intelligence, and clarity. The game had changed silently, but irrevocably. And for the first time, I felt the quiet satisfaction of knowing that the balance of power was no longer something imposed from above. It was something I could wield subtly, wisely, and unassailably. Even after the plates were cleared and the soft clinking of silver where faded into the background, the atmosphere of that night lingered. My father's presence at the head of the table remained commanding, but now it carried a quiet tension, an unspoken acknowledgement of the shift that had occurred. I could sense that the dynamic between us had changed not in anger, not in confrontation, but in a profound, invisible way. Walking through the living room later, past the muted hum of the television and the soft murmur of my siblings chatting in another corner, I reflected on what had truly happened. This was never about simple revenge or causing embarrassment. It was about reclaiming something I had spent years lacking: agency, clarity, and the knowledge that subtle action, careful observation, and patience could allow me to navigate even the most complex of relationships with precision and power. I remembered my father's smile that night, the one that had seemed so confident at first, so filled with authority. In retrospect, it had been a mask, fragile and imperfect, easily undone by the quiet, deliberate choices I had made. And in that realization, I felt an unexpected wave of empathy. It wasn't hate that drove me, but understanding, the recognition that power and control, when wielded without care, can create vulnerability just as much as strength. Later, as I sat alone, the house quiet around me, I thought about the lessons this one evening had etched into my mind. Observing, anticipating, acting with precision, these weren't just tools for navigating family dynamics, but principles for life itself. And in that moment, I realized that true power isn't always loud or visible. Sometimes it's the quiet, calculated decisions, the patience to wait, the clarity to act when the time is right, and the wisdom to see the larger picture that shapes the course of our lives. Looking back on that dinner, I understood something else too, that every family carries its hidden battles, its subtle currents of tension and control. But even within those currents, there is room for agency, for reclaiming balance, and for asserting oneself without unnecessary confrontation. That night had been a masterclass in understanding people, reading situations, and acting with both courage and discretion. And as I finally lay my head down that night, a sense of calm satisfaction washed over me. Not from triumph in the traditional sense, not from drama or spectacle, but from the quiet, undeniable knowledge that I had acted wisely, skillfully, and decisively. The balance had shifted, the lesson had been learned, and I had emerged not just victorious, but transformed, more observant, more strategic, more aware of the subtle forces that shape our interactions. That dinner, that single act of swapping glasses, was more than a moment. It was a turning point. A moment that demonstrated how patience, clarity, and careful action can create profound change. And while no one else might have fully understood what had occurred, I carried the understanding with me, a quiet strength that would guide my decisions, my relationships, and my sense of self in the years to come. Because sometimes the most powerful victories are invisible to the world, but entirely transformative to the one who orchestrates them. And that night, quietly, invisibly, I had claimed my own. The following days were quiet, almost deceptively ordinary. Life at home resumed its usual rhythm, but I noticed subtle changes in the way my father interacted with me. There was a new respect in his gaze, a recognition that I had grown beyond the role he had once unconsciously imposed on me. I didn't need to speak about that night, nor did I need to flaunt my victory. The shift had already taken place silently, irrevocably. I reflected often on what had happened at that dinner, and with each reflection, the lessons became clearer. Life, I realized, isn't about overt battles or dramatic confrontations. True influence comes from awareness, patience, and understanding the subtle currents that flow beneath the surface of every interaction. That evening, I had seen those currents, navigated them, and acted decisively at exactly the right moment. The incident also gave me a new understanding of my family. My father, once seemingly invincible in his authority, was human, capable of missteps, vulnerable to observation, and subject to the consequences of his own actions. My siblings, still blissfully unaware of the silent duel that had played out over glasses of wine, continued their lives, but even their presence now carried a different weight for me, a deeper appreciation for the subtle dynamics that shape our relationships. I carried that evening with me, not as a story of revenge, but as a testament to patience, strategy, and emotional intelligence. It was proof that even in situations where power seems firmly held by another, it is possible to reclaim agency without confrontation or chaos, simply by seeing clearly, acting wisely, and trusting your judgment. And so the memory of that dinner remained vivid, not for the tension, not for the shock, but for the quiet triumph of knowing that I had acted with clarity and purpose. That night had reshaped my relationship with my father, redefined the balance in our household, and reminded me of the subtle but profound power of patience and insight. Looking back, I understood the lasting truth of that moment. Sometimes the greatest victories are not the ones announced loudly, not the ones celebrated publicly, but the ones carried silently in the mind and heart, quietly transforming your world from within. And in that quiet transformation, I found a sense of strength, clarity, and peace that no external force could ever take away. That night, with a simple act of observation and careful action, I had shifted the course of more than just a single dinner. I had shifted the course of my understanding, my confidence, and my place within the family, and that, more than anything else, was the victory I had sought. Because sometimes the most powerful moments are invisible to everyone else, yet entirely defining to the one who seizes them. That night, I seized mine.